And right now it's time for that time when we talk to our special guest. Tonight our special guest is Phil Gifford, a man of many talents, beginning with the creation of Loosehead Land back in 1973. Radio broadcaster, sports writer, breakfast host and author with 7 books to his credit. Phil is a classic baby boomer, and if you can do it, Phil has done it. Phil Gifford on the beat goes on.
Good to
Wow.
see you, mate.
I salute you, Phil Gifford.
Oh, well, thank you, and I salute you too.
Yeah, look, Phil, I went to write down, I thought, well, I'll tell our viewers all the things that Phil's done. There was that many I gave up writing in the end, like going, you have had a prolific life, haven't you, of entertainment, broadcasting, writing. You've done the lot.
Kind of. Basically, I've always been scared I wouldn't have a job. So whenever I was offered a job, sometimes I was literally working at 3 different jobs at the same time, But the only reason the main reason I did it really, well, when I was much younger, it was to pay the mortgages. But as things got a little bit more comfortable, the main reason I did it was because I enjoyed them all.
Well, your parents and my parents, they were brought up during the Depression, and they probably put the fear of God into you that you had to make a living.
Yeah, I guess so.
Think that happened?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. There was also another part of me, I think maybe, in that my father was a dairy farmer just outside Morrinsville in the Waikato, and when I was having grown up seeing how hard he worked, working in journalism, radio, whatever, it never sort of felt like real work to me. And I've always, and to this day, bizarrely enough, I still have a tiny tinge of guilt that I'm not doing real work, So I've tried to make up for that by doing an awful lot of not real work.
Hey, what a great year. 1947. You and me, both 1947 babies. What was your date, Phil?
January 26th.
January 26th in 1947.
1947.
So you were a 6-month-old baby when I arrived.
Oh, there you
I
go.
was born on the 3rd of
I'm
July.
the big boy.
Yeah. So we both grew up with the same influences in New Zealand.
Yeah.
What a wonderful country it was, wasn't it? It was just peaceful and...
yes, it was. And I mean, when I look back on it, I really believe that I did have, for want of a better word, an idyllic childhood. I mean, because I mentioned Dad was a farmer. When I was 10, he'd been a heavy smoker, which is why I'm a fairly virulently anti-smoking Nazi now.
You've had enough smoke to last a lifetime.
Yeah, but when I was 10, Dad was diagnosed. He had emphysema and it affected his heart, and he couldn't do physical work anymore. And we moved to Waihi Beach. And Dad got a job on the little local paper, believe it or not. It's a huge career switch from dairy farmer to
a local
newspaper editor. But it was the editor, he was the reporter. It was a one-man newspaper, And so my childhood years and the most formative ones, I always think, from the time I was 12 until I was 17, I lived at Waihi Beach. And it was just an amazing place to grow up.
Chasing girls down the beach?
Not so good on the surfing, and not sensationally good. I mean, I chased, but I didn't catch a heck of a lot. But Waihi College was a fantastic place to go to, a little country school, only 400 kids from the 3rd form through to the 7th form, and played every sport that was available, which was nowhere near as many as there are now, but still just had a great time because everything. There was no, when I look at it now, and you'll feel exactly the same. There was no pressure on us as far as having to wear the white shirt, the right shirt. I mean, having to wear the right brand of basketball boots, having to. There was nothing. There was conformity in a way, but there was a lot less pressure really because we didn't have. We weren't bombarded with advertising, and we were also, weren't we? We were the last no television generation.
Yes, exactly. A little aside about the Waihi, for our Waihi viewers. I haven't been there for 30 years, except about 2 weeks ago, my brother's just shifted there, Shadesmith, wonderful songwriter.
Yeah.
And he's got a home in Waihi. And then, of course, we drove down to Waihi Beach, and there's a lovely cafe there. And we had a cup of...
The Flat White Cafe,
the Flat White Cafe.
Beach,
so let's say hi to all the Waihi beach people. So isn't that funny? You bring that subject up, and I haven't been there for 30 years until 2 weeks ago. But look, moving on, Phil, you got out of that area in the sense of the idyllic, wonderful childhood that we both had, and I was a Huntley boy, of course, so we're in the Waikato. Yep. But then you got into journalism, and you were writing a column for a newspaper, but somehow you stepped above everybody else by creating a character called Loosehead Len. Now, I can remember that coming out, and that was huge, wasn't it? And
Yeah, it was what
you made your name with Loosehead Len, wasn't it? So, how did you do that?
How did it happen? Well,
yeah.
Very briefly, I was working. I started as a cadet at the Herald,
Yeah.
and then I was fortunate enough to work for the New Zealand Press Association at the Mexico City Olympics when I was only 21, and I sort of springboarded from that and went and lived in England for 2 years in a little town called Sevenoaks in Kent, south of London, and worked for a little local paper. And then at the end of that 2 years, just before I came back to New Zealand, I worked for the New Zealand Press Association again, working at the Edinburgh Commonwealth Games. At the Edinburgh Games, I met a guy called Mike Gibson from Sydney, who wrote for the Daily Telegraph, and later on became quite well known as on radio on 2SM and also on television, I believe, as well. But Mike Gibson was a really lovely guy, and he wrote funny stories about sport, which nobody in New Zealand was doing.
Yeah.
And I took the time, I hung around and met the bloke when he was filing his copy one night at the press centre. We had a chat, and he told me, and it really resonated with me, he said he was one of a horde of rugby league writers in Sydney.
Yep.
And he decided, how will I
to get above
how
the
will I
rest
pop
of the
up
pack?
here?
Yeah,
How will I
yeah.
get my hand up here?
Yeah.
And he went to his editor and said, I want to write a column, and his club was North Sydney. And he said, I want to write a column in which I say that North Sydney are fantastic, and every other club team in Sydney Rugby League are a bunch of idiots and morons and dorks. And he said, the rest of the people, the North Sydney people will love me, so they'll read it, and the rest of the people will hate me, and they'll read it. So what's this jerk said, you know? And so when I came back, I moved to the Auckland Star. They had the 8 o'clock, viewers may remember the 8 o'clock Saturday night sports newspaper. I went to the editor of the 8 o'clock, a guy called Neil Anderson, and said I would like to do this column about rugby in Auckland. And he was really enthusiastic. This was 1971 was the first season. Then he said, right, you have to go. And then I got cold feet because I didn't want to do it under my own name because I didn't have the confidence. I thought, what if it doesn't work? And I'll be burdened forever. That's the moron that tried to do a funny column. The next year, he offered it to me again. No, this is how silly we were. It's the third year he finally said, why don't we do it under a false name? So I said, yeah. And within 2 days, maybe within a day, I had the name. I toyed with Tight Head Ted and Offside Fred, but I settled on Loosehead Len because I like the name Len. And I also, I had the whole background to him in my head, you know, that he was a World War II veteran, that he drove a 1937 Chev, that he worked in the last foundry in Herne Bay. I don't know if there was ever a foundry in Herne Bay, but in my mind, he drank at the glue pot.
Drank at the glue pot,
and then on about the second week or third week of the column, and nobody knew that it was me doing it. And back then, I was 26 years old, I had hair to my shoulders, all of that stuff. I didn't look remotely like Loosehead Len. I probably do a bit now, but back then I didn't. And anyway, nobody knew who it was. But in about the third or fourth week, I had this weird idea, and I put this line in a column, and this is the one character that I didn't really have a background to. Finally, here's a request for Susan of Herne Bay, Brian Williams' right thigh. That was the first ever Susan of Herne Bay line. And Susan of Herne Bay, as the column progressed, because it lasted for over 30 years, Susan of Herne Bay became, like when I meet old guys especially that used to really enjoy it in the 70s and the 80s when it was at its height, they always bring up Susan Herne Bay, you know, like, where is she now? I say, oh, she's terrorising old guys at the Mount Roskill Twilight Home, you know. But Susan Herne Bay developed the whole life of her own. And look, just briefly, I've got to say, every now and again, I think something comes along in your life that, if you're lucky, it really clicks.
Yeah.
And Loosehead Len, for me,
clicked.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Without Loosehead, for example, without Loosehead, I would never have worked in radio.
Yeah, it led on to everything else.
It led to everything else. It just opened so many doors.
Yeah. 7 books you've written on Loosehead Len.
7 Loosehead books, yeah. But most of all, for me, it's as you say, it was the doors that it opened, both professionally and even privately to a degree, because like Loosehead was a Ponsonby Rugby Club follower, and he couldn't stand any other rugby club apart from Ponsonby. And as time went on, Brian Williams, who Susan of Herne Bay's right thigh was his first request, BG's actually a really good friend, and only last year they had a lovely roast of Loosehead Len, aka me, at the Ponsonby Club, and so there are many very close and dear friends at the Ponsonby Club.
Wow.
You know,
Now, sport.
Yeah.
What was it about sport that just got you got the kettle boiling.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
it's interesting. When I first went into journalism as an 18-year-old, I wanted to be a sports journalist. And I discovered at the Herald that the general news reporters regarded the sports journalists with a certain amount of arrogance, as in the sports journalists, well, they're not really journalists, they're just doing this Mickey Mouse thing, which is not real. It's not like politics or court reporting and stuff. And I have to admit, to my shame, when I look back on it, when I came back to New Zealand, and I would have been, I guess, about 23 or something, when I worked at the Auckland Star, which I did right throughout the 1970s, the whole of that decade I was at the Auckland Star as a print journalist, and I worked in general reporting because I was kind of embarrassed about the fact that, well, that's not being a real journalist, and yet, and then finally, I mean, now, hands up, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a sports journalist.
An out-and-out sports journalist.
Yeah, exactly.
You've been outed.
Exactly, mate. And I mean, one of the reasons for that, very simply, is that having covered the real stuff, a lot of it is so dark and depressing and so on. Whereas, and there are some sad stories in sport as well, but by and large, a lot of the sports stories are the stories of triumph. They're the stories of people succeeding. They're the stories of people rising above adversity and achieving and winning championships and stuff like that. And I may also say that by and large, I found sports people incredibly enjoyable to talk to and to deal with. And most of all, if I'm being absolutely trying to analyse it, most of all, to me, the greatest theatre in life, and as much as I love movies, I love theatre, and as you know, I love music, but the greatest theatre of all is live sport.
Yeah.
Because when you think about, for example, that ODI at Eden Park the other weekend, when that young man that none of us had ever heard of, gets that close to winning the game single-handed. Saying to the other guy, no, we won't take a single, we won't even take 2 runs, because I'm going to get one at the end of the over, and then I'm going to come down, hit 3 sixes, and then I'll hit a single sort of thing. Well, that stuff, in reality, if you wrote a script, if you're a film producer, and I come
They'd say, no, that wouldn't happen.
It'll never happen.
No
mate.
way that would happen.
And that to me is what I particularly love about sport.
Yeah. Now, here's your test. What's the name of the 675th All Black?
As Murray Mexted might say, you're barking up the wrong horse here. I'm sorry, no.
No, I just thought, just to tease you there.
Tane Norton?
Yeah.
No, I have no
idea of myself.
No.
But I know people that possibly could tell you.
And I mean, one of the things which is sometimes vaguely embarrassing for me is because I've been around for so long, and I've been lucky enough to actually go to a lot of these great games. Like I've been to every Rugby World Cup. I've covered every rugby test in New Zealand since 1977, for God's sake. I've actually been at the games. But here's the thing. A lot of them, I can remember who won, but I can't remember the score. I can remember an outstanding try, but I can't remember everybody that scored. I can remember bits of the game. What I tend to remember, if I'm being absolutely honest, is weird little things that happened inside the game, or maybe even after the game. You know what I mean? So I remember the anecdotes. I remember the stories. Like, for example, when Buck Shelford, funnily enough, I wasn't at the game, but I can tell you something about when 1986 in Nantes, when the French team beat the All Blacks. I can't remember what the score was. It was obviously just before the World Cup was the end of it, 1986. Buck Shelford, bless him, played on with a split scrotum. He'd been kicked in the groin. And here's what I can tell you about that game, and it's the only real thing I can remember about it. Mark Brooke-Cowden, who was either the flanker or the reserve flanker that day, was in the changing shed. He looked across. There was a French doctor kneeling in front of Buck Shelford who had no clothes on, and Mark Brooke-Cowden thought, I wonder what he's doing. He looked over he made the bad mistake of looking over the French doctor's shoulders, saw what he was doing, which was sewing up Buck, and had to go and lie down in the showers because he was going to faint. Now that's what I remember about those sort of games, rather than the actual points.
When we were joking before about the 675th All Black, you made a comment then, a saying, a New Zealand saying. Now, Loosehead Land was just famous for those turn of Kiwi phrases, weren't you? Where did they come from?
Well, I mean, there are some of them that I kind of made up. But I'll tell you the most weird one, Jared. It's really weird. And it was actually, I was briefly for a flash on a national news broadcast in association with some years ago, when the Oxford Dictionary brought out a special New Zealand edition that had been worked on. I'm trying to think the guy's name, Harry Osman, I think, but I apologise if that's not his name. But he was a professor, I think, from Victoria University. He'd worked on it for like 15 years. And he credited me with inventing the phrase after-match function. Now, I went, well, thank you, that's very sweet to say that. It's patently untrue. That's what they were always called when I was a kid growing up. So, look, the one huge part that Lucy Lynn and I had in common is, as I mentioned, I grew up in the country and I grew up around and involved and playing rugby and other sports, but particularly rugby. And as part of that, and the first year that I left high school, I didn't go straight into journalism. I worked for 1 year in a labouring gang in the Forest Service in Thames in the Coronga Valley. Now, one of the things, when I look back on it, that all of that background had.
Just by osmosis, you must have been hearing.
Exactly. I picked up an awful lot of slang. And when I was writing Lucid, I tried, especially in the early days, I tried to write with using expressions
that those guys would recognise.
That they would recognise, and that my mum and dad maybe had used. So, look, I'll tell you a word that you might remember from your childhood, but I'm guaranteeing you, I'm guessing, like me, you probably haven't heard anybody actually say it for 40 years at least. And that is, instead of saying he was drunk, saying he was really shickered. He was shicker. He was shicker. S-H-I-C-K-A. Now, I've got no idea whether that's an Australian word, an Old English word, a New Zealand word. No idea.
He was shickered,
He was shickered.
I'm quite familiar with that.
Exactly, you know, and good as gold and all those sort of things. And so I've always had a great weakness and a liking for those phrases. And I'll tell you, a brilliant comedian that I think used some of them to great effect was John Clark with Fred Dagg.
Exactly.
Whether it was get him behind, and all those phrases, those lovely phrases that people can recognise.
Well, it must have been the farming background. You know, you must have heard things.
Yeah.
Look, Phil, we've got a couple of things I want to talk about, but we've covered that much of a career. You know, then there's radio, of course. All the different television shows you've done, but just recently. Both you and I live in a PC world now, and I see an article that you were quite annoyed about the treatment Peter Leach has received with. It was
the Waiheke Islanders.
So,
my criticism.
How do you cope with it today? It must drive you mad.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think my argument with what happened with Peter, who was a very dear friend and has been since he was a one-shop butcher out at Monterey, you know. But my argument over what happened with Peter had nothing to do with, oddly enough, although I know a lot of people felt that it maybe felt that it did, but I tried to make it clear in the story. My argument wasn't with the actual incident, because Peter himself knows that it probably wasn't, it was not something that he should have said. I mean, it was harmless, he meant it to be harmless. But
you could hear him saying that as a joke. It would be just a joke.
But it was misconstrued. But I have no argument with that whatsoever. Peter has apologised and he meant it, and that's that. What I was upset about was that some people springboarded, and this is what happens with social media and stuff. So put the original thing aside. It is what it is. There was a misunderstanding and a young woman was hurt by it. So, and Peter's very sorry for that. But what springboarded from that were people suggesting somehow that Peter, A, was a dyed-in-the-wool racist, and B, that had been, you know, hadn't been a nice person and had treated people badly and so on and so on. All of which, as you know, and as I absolutely know, is a complete nonsense. I mean, this is a guy that whatever Peter is or isn't, he's got a good heart, you know, and he cares about people and he wants to do the right thing by people. So, you know, I was happy to defend him.
Well, the reason I brought it up was that both you and I are the same age and we live in New Zealand, which none of these stories would have meant anything back in our day, but and now you and I are having to put up with the silliness of it. It is so silly that we live in such
I hate to say this, we might be at slightly cross purposes here, because I mean, one of the things I think actually is that there are some things that I think are a little bit over the top, but I'm also, as it happens, I'm a reasonably, Winston Peters would call me a sickly white liberal, Jared, because I'm actually quite a politically correct person myself, because I think that, look, I got brought up and put on the straight and narrow way back in the 1970s about feminism, for example, because I worked for the Listener magazine and I worked in an office with two very strong women Pauline Ray and the late, sadly, the late Marcia Russell, who was an absolute pioneer of women's journalism. And again, for people that are old enough to remember, she was the woman that brought out the first really dynamic women's magazine in New Zealand, with all due respect.
And her work on Revolution was just
Thursday magazine, which was a fantastic magazine, you know. Now, up until I started working with Marcia, for example, I had used the phrase about a rugby player that was a bit windy, that I played like a big girl. So Marcia, who was very sweet, but absolutely had a back of iron, sat me down one day and said, look, Phil, you know this phrase you use quite a bit about like a big girl? I went, yeah. She said, well, has it ever occurred to you that that's kind of insulting to girls? And I went, no, I never thought of that. She said, well, it actually is, isn't it? I went, yeah, okay. So since about it was the late 70s, since about 1979, I've never used the phrase, he's a big girl, you know. So look, I think...
No, the world has changed. I totally agree with you, but sometimes the pendulum just swings too far.
Yeah, I just think one of the things that all of us have to be aware of, though, which when I was growing up and you were growing up, we weren't. People just had to, you were supposed to just cop it. If people said things about you that were nasty, that were maybe homophobic or sexist or whatever, or racist, God forbid, then the idea was, well, if he can't cop it, forget him. But I think we do have to remember that sticks and stones break my bones, words will never hurt me, is absolute codswallop. In actual fact, words can be incredibly hurtful, you know, and so it just being, I mean, again, God, it sounds so wimpy, but it's a fact. I just think that the most important thing, if there's one thing that I think is important in life, is being kind to people. Yeah. Being kind and decent to people, because if everybody did that, what a very different world we would be in.
Well, you know, here's Peter Leach has done so much for so many people, worked endlessly for charity, and for him to have to suffer the slings and arrows of people, you know, I thought that was terrible. So
yeah, it was. I mean, it was.
That's what I was really saying.
Yeah, absolutely. It was wildly over the top, you know. But there you go. I mean, Peter, it affected him enormously, because I spent a lot of time with him in the days immediately after it. Affected him enormously, but I'm happy to say, you know, he's
resilient.
He is resilient. Yeah.
Phil, we've got to finish, but look. A day in the life, very quickly, of Phil Gifford today, 2017, full of
well, just very quickly,
fascinating, exciting things to do.
Yeah, it is,
of course,
really.
Coming in and seeing this on the beat
exactly.
goes on would be one of them.
Exactly, you know, I mean, a week in the life for me, basically, is I do a radio thing every weekend on ZB, on Sport with Tony Veach. I do a couple of things a week on ZB with Larry Williams. I write a sports column for the Sunday Star Times every weekend. I write a music column for North and South magazine now, which I'm really enjoying. I haven't written about music for many years. And also, I'm writing books. So I have just finished a book called Looking After Your Nuts and Bolts, which is a book in association with the New Zealand Men's Health Trust, which will come out for New Zealand Men's Health Month this year in June. And it is...
Would you like to come back on the show and talk about that?
I would love to come and talk about it, mate, because I just think if there's one thing New Zealand guys don't do very well, it's look after ourselves and our health. Exactly. That's the one.
Phil, wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you in June anyway.
Yeah,
we'll talk about that.
I'd love to.
And,
sweet.
All the best.
Thank you, and the same to you.
2017, another great winner for Phil Gifford.
I'll see you.
I salute you.
Thank you.